When the HOA bulldozed his lakeside mansion over unpaid fees, they thought they'd won. But what they didn't know was that the man they just humiliated wasn't just a homeowner. He was the rightful owner of everything beneath their feet. And when he revealed the truth, their entire empire came crashing down. If you believe that karma always finds its way back, make sure to subscribe, because this story is living proof that justice never misses its mark. The morning light shimmered over Lake Waverly like molten gold. Dew clung to the wild reeds, and the air was heavy with that damp, nostalgic scent of pine and water. Perched on the edge of the valley stood the old Weston mansion, a sprawling, cedar-built masterpiece that looked more like it belonged in a painting than real life. It was mine. I bought it 3 years ago, not for its luxury, but for the silence it offered. After my father passed, I wanted a place where the world couldn't reach me. I had grown tired of boardrooms, contracts, and fake smiles. The lake, though it had peace, but peace, I'd learn, doesn't survive long when power-hungry people smell control. The trouble began with a letter. A plain white envelope taped to my gate. Notice of delinquent HOA fees. At first, I laughed. My property sat on 26 acres of privately zoned land. There was no HOA jurisdiction here. No board, no meetings, no rules. But the letter was signed, Waverly Lakes Homeowners Association. I tossed it aside, assuming it was a clerical mistake. A week later, another letter came, this time thicker. A breakdown of past-due maintenance charges, totaling over $8,400. For landscaping, community lighting, and, oddly, lake beautification fees. That's when I realized it wasn't a mistake. That weekend, I drove into the small cluster of houses down the valley, homes built over the last few years by a development company called Volcrest Holdings. I'd never paid much attention before, but now I noticed their signs, their perfect hedges, their matching mailboxes, the signs of an HOA creeping outward like ivy. When I approached the HOA office, a small prefab building at the valley entrance, the receptionist gave me a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Are you here to settle your outstanding balance, Mr. Weston?" "I'm here to tell you," I said calmly, "that my property isn't part of your association." She blinked, hesitated, then said, "You'll need to speak to the president." Her name was Margaret Hale. 62 years old, sharp bob haircut, pearl earrings, and the kind of authority that fed on control. She met me with a smirk, flipping through papers as if I was wasting her time. "Mr. Weston," she said, "your property is within the Waverly Lakes district. By default, you're subject to community regulations and dues." By default. I repeated. This land was privately deeded to my family in 1943. It predates your subdivision by 70 years. Margaret didn't even look up. "That may be, but the association voted to annex the lakeside perimeter last fall. You'll have to comply." I felt my jaw tighten. "You can't just vote to take private land." She smiled, the kind of smile that said she'd already won. "We can, and we did. Welcome to Waverly Lakes." That night, I stood by the lake, the moon trembling in the ripples like a nervous eye. My father's voice echoed in memory, "Always know what you own, son. Never let someone else define it for you." He had once told me that the valley itself, the lake, the ridges, and everything between, was part of a single deed that our family never sold. It was land passed down quietly, generation to generation. But I had never checked. Not once. Over the next few weeks, I started receiving fines, absurd ones. $250 for a non-regulation mailbox, $400 for excessive grass height, then a $1,200 lake access maintenance fee. They were trying to break me down, paper by paper. By month's end, they sent a final notice. If payment is not received within 10 days, the HOA reserves the right to pursue enforcement actions under local statute. I ignored it. 10 days later, I came home to chaos. A bulldozer, a pile of splintered wood where my front deck used to be, and a sheriff's car parked at the gate. Margaret Hale stood there in her beige suit, arms crossed, clipboard in hand. The officer avoided my eyes as he said, "Mr. Weston, the association has executed a compliance order. You've been in violation of multiple code provisions." "What code?" I demanded. "You don't have authority here." Margaret's voice cut through the air like a blade. "You had your chance to cooperate. Now we're bringing your property up to standard." I watched as workers tore down the western porch, hauling my furniture into the yard. My late father's chair. My mother's piano. My dog barked until his voice broke. By evening, half the mansion's face was gone. I stood there helpless, rage boiling under my skin, my heart hammering with disbelief. I called the county, the sheriff's office, even a lawyer I knew in the city. But Margaret was clever. She had manipulated zoning maps and local bylaws to make it appear as though my property fell within the HOA's reach. That night, as the dust settled and the last truck drove away, I made a decision. I wouldn't sue them. I wouldn't argue. I'd bury them. Because if my father's stories were true, if what he told me about the valley was real, then they hadn't just destroyed my home. They had destroyed something that already belonged to me, legally, permanently, and fully. And I was going to make them regret ever touching a single plank of it. The night after my mansion was torn apart, the valley was silent, too silent. The lake no longer shimmered, it looked like black glass. The once comforting whisper of pine needles now sounded like whispers plotting revenge. I stood among the ruins, holding a single candle, staring at the splintered remains of my father's porch. In the chaos, they had left behind something strange, a cracked piece of stone jutting out from the ground where the porch once stood. It looked like the edge of an old foundation or marker. As I brushed away the dirt, I found engraved letters barely visible in the dim light. Weston Land Co. 1914. A piece of history buried beneath my home. That night I couldn't sleep. I spent hours combing through my father's old office files in the surviving section of the house. Dust-covered boxes lined the shelves, each labeled in his neat handwriting. And then I found it, a leather-bound folder with the words, "Deed of Valley Trust." Inside were faded blueprints, surveys, and a yellow deed with wax seals still intact. My breath caught as I read the line that changed everything. This document certifies that ownership of Waverly Valley, including the natural lake, surrounding ridges, and adjacent lands within survey lines 21A33C, remains in the possession of the Weston family and its legal heirs in perpetuity. Perpetuity. Meaning forever. The HOA hadn't just encroached. They had built on my family's land. Their entire community. The fancy homes, the paved roads, even Margaret Hale's office, all of it sat squarely inside the valley boundaries listed on that document. And if this deed was still valid, they were not only trespassing, they were illegally collecting money from properties they didn't own. The realization hit like a storm. I wasn't just the victim. I was the rightful owner of everything they had claimed as theirs. The next morning, I drove to the county records office with the deed, determined to confirm its legitimacy. The clerk, an older man named Robert, adjusted his glasses as I handed him the fragile papers. He examined them carefully, flipping between pages, occasionally typing on his terminal. After 20 tense minutes, he looked up. "Where did you get this?" "It's been in my family since before the war," I said. "Why?" He exhaled slowly. "Because this is the original valley title. It's still active. No transfer, no sale, no void notice. Nothing. This means," he paused, as if struggling to believe it himself, "technically, everything in this recorded zone still belongs to the Weston estate." I felt my pulse quicken. "Everything?" He nodded. "Every square foot. The lake. The roads. Even the lots they develop. If those homes are inside this boundary, they're built on your land." For a moment the room tilted. Margaret Hale hadn't just wronged me, she had unknowingly placed her entire HOA on land that was never legally theirs. Robert lowered his voice. "You could pursue a full reclamation claim. But once you do, this is going to become a war. I gave him a faint smile. They started it. The following week, I met with an attorney, Elena Vaughn, a property law specialist. She was sharp, calm, and fearless. After reviewing the deed and confirming its authenticity, she said, "You're sitting on a bomb, Mr. Weston. If this goes public, that HOA is finished." We filed the first motion quietly, a notice of land ownership dispute. It was just paperwork for now, but it froze any HOA operations tied to enforcement or fines. Within 48 hours, Margaret Hale called me directly. Her voice was tight. "You can't just file something like this without?" "I can," I interrupted. "And I did." Her tone wavered. "This is harassment." "No, Margaret. What you did, bulldozing private property, falsifying fees, that's harassment. What I'm doing is called justice." There was a long silence. Then a click. She hung up. Within days, the valley turned restless. Rumors spread. Residents began to question why HOA notices had stopped arriving. Contractors halted work. The weekly community cleanup was canceled without explanation. The calm, perfect image of Waverly Lakes began to crack. Margaret tried to rally the board, but whispers of my deed leaked out. And the more people learned, the angrier they became. Some homeowners had poured their life savings into those properties. Others discovered that their mortgages were technically invalid because their homes sat on land without lawful title transfer. The HOA tried damage control. They claimed I was lying, that my deed was outdated or forged. But when the county's own office validated it publicly, everything changed overnight. News vans arrived at the Valley Gate. Reporters stood in front of my half-demolished mansion, broadcasting headlines like, "Man claims to own entire HOA community after illegal destruction." I watched from my porch steps as drones buzzed overhead, capturing the chaos I never wanted. But this wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about legacy. My father had protected this valley for decades, ensuring it stayed untouched by greed and corruption. I had failed him once by ignoring what I inherited. I wouldn't fail again. One evening, as the sun bled orange over the lake, I saw Margaret walking down the gravel path toward my gate. She looked smaller, her confidence cracked. Without saying a word, she slid a document through the bars, a cease and desist letter accusing me of malicious interference with community affairs. I smiled faintly as I looked it over. "Margaret," I said softly through the fence, "you might want to check whose ground you're standing on before you send me paperwork." She turned pale. Because she knew, she was standing on my land. That night, I stood on the lake's edge, the same place where everything had started. The wind rippled across the water, carrying the faint glow of distant porch lights from the homes below, homes that now legally belonged to me. But I didn't want their houses. I wanted accountability. I wanted every lie, every forged fee, every intimidation tactic to be exposed. So I called Elena the next morning. "It's time," I said. "Time for what?" she asked. "Time to reclaim the valley." In the coming weeks, we would file for full possession rights, forcing the HOA to either negotiate or face complete dissolution. Margaret and her board were about to learn that the valley they thought they controlled was built on a foundation of deception, and that foundation was about to crumble beneath them. But what I didn't know then was that Margaret wasn't done fighting. She was planning something desperate, something that could burn the valley down, both literally and legally. And soon, everything would erupt. The morning the valley began to burn started like any other, calm, quiet, deceptively peaceful. A mist drifted over the lake, curling around the ruins of my half-demolished mansion like smoke before the fire. I didn't know it yet, but Margaret Hale was already setting her final plan in motion, one that would turn the community's desperation into chaos. It started with a single notice nailed to every homeowner's door. The HOA, though legally frozen, had declared an emergency assessment fee, $10,000 per household, claiming it was needed for legal defense and property stabilization. It was a lie, of course. a last-ditch effort to gather funds to fight me in court. The residents, already furious, erupted. Protests broke out in front of the HOA office. People shouted, ripped down signs, demanded refunds. Margaret stayed hidden inside her house, blinds drawn, while the valley boiled over. Meanwhile, I was gathering proof, every map, record, and signature that showed how deeply she'd manipulated the county. Elena and I had spent nights at my kitchen table, documents spread like battle plans, cross-referencing every fraudulent annexation the HOA had forged. What we uncovered was staggering. Margaret hadn't acted alone. The entire Waverly Lakes development was tied to Volcrest Holdings, a shell company owned by her son, Thomas Hale. Through falsified plats and zoning extensions, they'd gradually expanded the HOA's borders onto private lands, exploiting legal loopholes to justify annexation. They'd built an empire of paper, a fake kingdom based on signatures and intimidation. And when I refused to comply, I became their example. But now the foundation of their scheme was exposed. By midweek, county investigators began auditing their finances. News stations camped outside the HOA office. Residents stopped paying fees altogether. Margaret's perfect control had disintegrated into anarchy. That's when the threats began. Anonymous letters appeared in my mailbox, short, typed, unsigned. Stop this or regret it. You think you own us? You'll lose everything again. At first, I ignored them. But one morning, I found something else, a dead crow nailed to my gate. Its feathers soaked in red paint, a note pinned to its wing. Property burns faster than paper. I handed it to Elena. They're getting desperate, she said, her voice low. Margaret knows she's cornered. Desperate people make mistakes. She was right. That night, I noticed lights moving through the valley, flashlights, 2 or 3 figures walking along the tree line. I stood by the window, heart pounding, as they disappeared toward the lake. Minutes later, the faint sound of splashing reached my ears, followed by the smell of gasoline. They were trying to destroy the evidence, burn the files, maybe even the lake house remnants. I ran out with my flashlight, the cold air biting my face. The beam caught movement near the water. 3 people, one holding a red fuel can. I shouted, but they scattered. A spark flared. One of them had dropped a lighter. Then came the sound I'll never forget. A deep, muffled whoosh. Flames erupted across the shoreline, racing through the dry reeds. The reflection of fire on the lake looked like liquid gold bleeding into the night. My heart slammed against my ribs as I grabbed a garden hose, spraying furiously, but it was useless. The wind carried the fire like a living thing, wrapping around the trees, consuming everything in its path. Within minutes, my yard was glowing orange. The sirens came next. Volunteer firefighters, their trucks struggling down the narrow gravel road. Neighbors screamed, dogs barked, and the valley was swallowed by chaos. By dawn, the fire was finally under control. My property was blackened, the pier gone, half the trees scorched. But the investigators found something else among the ashes, a melted fuel can with fingerprints. It didn't take long for the prints to trace back to Thomas Hale. The arrest came swiftly. Margaret's son was taken into custody for arson and property destruction. When news broke, the valley imploded again. Cameras swarmed her doorstep. Residents demanded her resignation. The once untouchable queen of the HOA was now cornered in her crumbling castle of lies. But even then, she refused to yield. When the police questioned her, she denied everything. Claimed I'd set the fire myself for sympathy. Accused me of fabricating the deed. She even held a small press meeting on her lawn, shaking papers at reporters, shouting that I was an imposter trying to steal her community. The world, though, had already turned against her. By the end of the week, every news outlet carried the same headline: HOA President's son arrested for arson amid Valley ownership scandal. Margaret went silent after that. Her office closed. The HOA board members resigned one by one. But her silence was not surrender. Late one night, I got a call from Elena. "You should see this," she said, voice trembling slightly. "Margaret just filed a lawsuit against you. Personal damages, emotional distress, slander. She's claiming you're a fraud." I couldn't help but laugh bitterly. "She's burning everything she has left." Elena sighed. "She doesn't care about winning. She just wants to drag you down with her." The court date was set for early spring. As the valley recovered from the fire, the scars remained, both on the land and in the people. The homeowners were lost, unsure who to believe. Some came to me quietly, apologizing for the destruction. Others stayed hostile, convinced I'd ruined their lives. But I wasn't stopping. The more I dug, the clearer it became that Margaret's empire had been built entirely on deception. Property lines forged, signatures copied, fees funneled into personal accounts. She wasn't running a neighborhood, she was running a con. And now I had the proof. Elena prepared the countersuit: Weston vs. Hale, Waverly Lakes HOA, and Volcrest Holdings, claiming not only restitution for the damage done to my home, but full reclamation of all land rights within the valley's original boundary. It wasn't about money anymore. It was about truth, about exposing how corruption hides behind paperwork and politeness. On the morning I filed the suit, I stood once more by the lake. The water was calm again, the charred earth slowly turning green. But deep down, I knew this was only the eye of the storm. Margaret Hale wasn't the type to surrender gracefully. She had one more move left. And if my instincts were right, it would be her most dangerous yet. The fire had burned my land, but what was coming next would burn reputations, families, and everything the HOA thought it owned. The valley's final reckoning had begun. The courthouse in Waverly County stood like a relic of old power, marble steps worn by a century of boots, iron lamps flickering under cloudy skies. On the morning of the hearing, the air outside was sharp, carrying the chill of something about to end. I arrived early, dressed simply, the same way my father would have. No showmanship, just quiet purpose. Inside, the lobby buzzed with reporters. Cameras flashed, microphones thrust forward, everyone hungry for sound bites. "Mr. Weston, are you really suing the entire HOA? Do you intend to evict the residents? Is this about revenge?" I said nothing. I didn't come here for spectacle. I came to put ghosts to rest. At the far end of the hall, Margaret Hale stood surrounded by her lawyers, 5 of them, all in sharp gray suits. She looked smaller now, but her eyes were still burning with that same cold defiance. Her son, Thomas, wasn't there. He was still awaiting sentencing for the arson. When our eyes met, neither of us spoke. But in that brief, tense silence, I could see it. She wasn't fighting for justice. She was fighting to keep control, to cling to the illusion of authority she'd built her identity on. The bailiff's voice echoed. Case 14-271 Weston vs. Hale, Waverly Lakes HOA, and Volcrest Holdings. All parties present. The courtroom fell silent. Judge Mendel presided, an older man with silver hair, known for his precision. He looked over the file for what felt like an eternity before speaking. "Let's begin." My attorney Elena rose first. Her voice was calm, steady, a blade wrapped in silk. "Your Honor, this case is not simply about a property dispute. It's about decades of deception. The Weston family's land, predating all HOA developments in Waverly Valley, has been unlawfully annexed, exploited, and monetized by the defendant. We intend to prove that every structure, every fee, every threat issued by the HOA was rooted in fraud." Margaret's lead attorney smirked as he stood. "Your Honor, this is fantasy. My client's association has lawfully governed the Waverly Lakes community for nearly 20 years. Mr. Weston's claim relies on a deed so ancient it may as well be carved in stone, one that hasn't been recognized in modern records for decades." The judge raised an eyebrow. "And yet, the county registrar confirms it's valid." The smirk faded. Elena pressed on. "The deed is not only valid, Your Honor, it was deliberately concealed. We will present evidence showing that Volcrest Holdings, A company owned by Mrs. Hale's son, falsified property boundaries and filed illegal plats to absorb Weston land into their development. This was done for profit, and to strip rightful ownership from the plaintiff. Margaret shifted uncomfortably, fingers clutching her pearls. When it was my turn to speak, I stood slowly, unfolding a map, the original 1914 survey, laminated and framed from my father's archives. I placed it on the evidence table. This, I said quietly, is the valley as it was drawn before Waverly Lakes existed. Every inch of land these homes stand on today lies within those original boundaries. My family never sold it, never transferred it. They built on it anyway. The judge studied it for a long moment. You're certain this is authentic? The county verified it, Elena replied. And so did the state surveyor's office. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Margaret's lawyers whispered frantically among themselves. For the first time, the unbreakable facade of her authority was cracking under fluorescent light. Over the next several hours, evidence unfolded like a slow-motion avalanche. Emails from Volcrest employees discussing quiet annexation. Internal HOA memos about adjusting boundary maps. Financial statements revealing thousands of dollars siphoned from resident fees into a private account registered under Margaret's name. Each piece of proof chipped away at her empire. By the time Elena rested our case, the courtroom was still. Even the judge's pen had stopped moving. Margaret's attorney rose again, his voice strained. Your Honor, at worst, we're talking about administrative oversight, paperwork errors, not criminal conspiracy. But the judge's expression was cold. Oversight doesn't explain the forged county seals or the misappropriated funds. Margaret finally stood, trembling, her composure gone. I did what I had to do, she shouted, voice echoing through the room. The HOA was falling apart before I took charge. I built this community. These people needed order. And she pointed a shaking finger at me. He let everything rot. He abandoned this valley. Her voice cracked. I saved it, she cried. And now you want to take it all away. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. The silence after her words was louder than anything I could have said. The judge sighed. Mrs. Hale, saving a community doesn't give you the right to steal it. When the gavel struck, it was over. The court ruled in my favor on all counts. The Weston family deed was upheld as the legitimate title of ownership. Every property developed under Waverly Lakes HOA fell under my jurisdiction. The association was dissolved effective immediately. Margaret and Volcrest Holdings were ordered to pay damages totaling over $2.3 million for property destruction, fraud, and unlawful annexation. But even in victory, I felt no triumph. Only an ache. The kind that comes when justice finally arrives, but too late to fix what's already broken. Margaret sat motionless, eyes glassy, as the reporters swarmed outside. Her empire had fallen, not with violence, but with truth. As I left the courthouse, the sky opened with a light drizzle, cleansing, quiet. Elena walked beside me, smiling faintly. You did it, she said. I looked at the horizon, where the valley stretched beneath the gray clouds. No, I said softly. We just set it right again. In the weeks that followed, the HOA signs came down one by one. The office was boarded up, the community gates dismantled. The residents, now free from the oppressive rules that had governed their lives, formed a new council, one that worked with me, not against me. The lake slowly healed. Birds returned. The scent of chardwood faded into the crisp air of spring. But one thing still haunted me. A letter arrived without a return address, neat handwriting, sealed with wax. Inside was a single line. You may own the valley, Mr. Weston. But the people will never forgive you. There was no signature. But I knew who had written it. Margaret Hale had vanished. No one had seen her since the verdict. And somehow, I knew, her story in this valley wasn't finished. Not yet. Months passed. The valley, once divided by fear and greed, had grown strangely quiet. Spring had turned to summer, and the lake sparkled again under the midday sun. From the charred soil, wildflowers began to bloom, yellow, purple, defiant against everything that had happened. For the first time in years, peace seemed possible. The Weston mansion was rebuilt, not as it was before, but simpler. A restored frame, wooden beams left exposed, open windows that welcomed the wind. I didn't want grandeur anymore. I wanted presence, something that felt alive, honest. Most residents had stayed. They were cautious around me at first, unsure whether I was friend or foe. But as the weeks went on, I opened the gates, helped them fix roads, repaired the old bridge, and waived any claim on the homes that stood on my land. Ownership meant nothing if it didn't heal what had been broken. I thought the ghosts had finally quieted. But then came the storm. It began late one evening when thunder rolled across the ridges. The sky turned the color of bruised steel, lightning tearing through the clouds. The lake, calm for weeks, churned violently under the wind. And then, as the rain began to fall, I saw something flicker through the trees, a faint orange glow near the old HOA office. I grabbed my raincoat and flashlight, heart pounding. When I reached the building, the door was already open. The inside was soaked, papers scattered across the floor, but there was a smell, faint perfume, lavender mixed with smoke. The scent was familiar. Margaret Hale. I called out, but only the echo of thunder answered. My light caught a figure in the corner, an empty chair, a single envelope sitting on the desk, sealed and marked, to the true owner of Waverly Valley. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside was a letter, handwritten in elegant script. "You've won, Mr. Weston. I built this community because I thought I could control it, fix what life had taken from me. But control is a poison that disguises itself as order. I wanted to feel needed again. When you exposed me, I saw myself clearly for the first time, not as a leader but as a thief. You were right to fight me. Still, I can't live in a valley where every face reminds me of what I've done. By the time you read this, I'll be gone. But before I leave, I've returned something that was always yours. Check the foundation beneath your father's study. No signature. Just a faint smudge of ink, like a tear had blurred the end of her sentence. I ran back through the rain toward my house, the storm clawing at my coat. Inside the study, the one part of the old mansion that had survived the fire, the air was still damp from years of neglect. I knelt by the wooden floorboards, tapping lightly until one sounded hollow. I pried it up with a screwdriver. Beneath, wrapped in oilcloth, was a small metal box. Inside lay a stack of documents, the missing survey maps, the original transfer papers that Volcrest Holdings had forged, and something else, a locket. I opened it carefully. Inside were two tiny photographs, one of Margaret, decades younger, smiling beside a man I recognized from my father's photos, Samuel Weston. My father. The realization hit like a blow. Margaret Hale had once been part of my father's life, perhaps even someone he trusted. Their connection ran deeper than either of us had known. No wonder she'd obsessed over the valley. It wasn't just control. It was memory. Regret. I sat there for a long time, rain hammering the windows, staring at that photograph. She wasn't just my enemy. She had once been family, or something close to it. The next morning, I drove down to the lakeshore. The storm had passed, but a strange calm lingered in the air. Mist hung low, curling like smoke over the water. At the far end of the dock stood a single item, a pearl earring glinting faintly in the light. Hers. Placed deliberately, as if she wanted me to find it. But there was no sign of Margaret. No footprints. No vehicle tracks. Just silence. The sheriff organized a search. Boats combed the lake, divers swept the shallows, but nothing was ever found. No body. No belongings. Only that letter, the locket, and the lingering scent of lavender that seemed to drift through the valley long after she vanished. The official report called it a voluntary disappearance. But I knew better. Margaret Hale hadn't vanished out of guilt. She'd left because she couldn't bear to face the people she'd ruled for so long. Some said they saw her months later, a gray-haired woman walking along the highway at dawn, heading north, away from Waverly County. I didn't chase the rumor. I let her go. Over the next year, the valley changed. Without the HOA, people began living freely. No more fines for mailbox colors, no more approved lawns. Kids played by the lake again. Neighbors shared gardens. The place felt human for the first time. And yet, every so often, I'd catch a glimpse of something familiar, a shape moving through the pines, a reflection in the water when no one else was there. The valley still had its secrets, its shadows. Sometimes, late at night, I'd sit on the porch, the old locket in my hand, and wonder whether Margaret's spirit still wandered somewhere out there. Not haunting, not angry, just watching. Because maybe, deep down, she'd loved this valley too. One evening, as summer faded into autumn, I stood by the lake again. The surface was glass smooth, the reflection of the moon shimmering like a coin tossed by time. I whispered into the wind, "It's over now." But the lake gave no answer. Only a faint ripple, gentle and unthreatening, as if the valley itself exhaled. The story of the HOA, the fire, and the ownership war had finally settled into legend. Reporters stopped calling. Lawsuits were closed. And though scars remained, the valley stood, quiet, resilient, reborn. I thought that was the end. Until, one morning, a letter arrived, postmarked from a small coastal town 2 states away. Inside was a single photograph. Margaret Hale, standing on a cliff, wind in her hair, smiling faintly. On the back, in her handwriting, were just 4 words. "Take care of it." The valley had always been more than land. It was a mirror, showing each of us who we really were when power stripped away the mask. For her, it revealed regret. For me, redemption. But as I placed that photo on the mantel, I couldn't shake the feeling that the story wasn't truly finished. Because sometimes, when the night settles deep over Lake Waverly, I still hear faint footsteps near the trees. Slow, steady, purposeful. Almost like someone still watching, still guarding what was once theirs, and what I now protect. A full year passed since Margaret's disappearance. The seasons came and went like chapters in a book, finally nearing its last page. The valley, once divided by fear, greed, and lawsuits, had grown peaceful again. The kind of peace that only comes after storms, both literal and human. I often walked the shoreline in the mornings, my reflection swaying softly over the lake's glassy surface. The air smelled clean again, untouched by smoke or resentment. Birds had returned. The sound of hammers and chainsaws, once constant during the HOA's reign, was replaced by laughter, the buzz of life rediscovering itself. Waverly Valley was breathing again. And yet, part of me couldn't rest. Margaret's letter, her photo, and the locket still sat on my study desk, silent witnesses to everything that had happened. Her message haunted me. Take care of it. For months, I wondered what she truly meant. The land? The people? Or maybe, something deeper, the lesson hidden beneath all the destruction. The rebuilding of the community became a collective effort. No more HOA board. No hierarchy. Just neighbors making decisions together, gathering under the restored gazebo by the lake every Sunday evening. We discussed repairs, garden projects, and local wildlife. For once, democracy wasn't paperwork, it was presence. I stayed quiet most of those meetings. I wasn't their leader anymore. I was just another resident who happened to own the land beneath their feet. But even that started to feel wrong. The more I watched them laugh and live freely, the more I realized, true ownership didn't come from deeds or document. It came from belonging, something my family's legacy had never really understood. My father had once told me that land was a man's inheritance. But standing there among people who'd rebuilt homes from ashes, I understood it differently now. The valley was everyone's inheritance. So I made a choice. It took 3 months of paperwork, lawyers, and local hearings, but by the end of it all, the deed to Waverly Valley no longer had my name on it. I donated it, every acre, every shoreline, every tree, to the people who lived there. Together, they formed a community trust. No single person could ever own the valley again. When the final documents were signed, the courthouse clerk looked at me, confused. "You're giving up millions in property value," she said. I smiled faintly. "You can't sell peace," I told her. And for the first time, I meant it. The news spread fast. Reporters returned for one last round of interviews, calling it the greatest act of restitution in Waverly County history. Some labeled me a hero, others said it was guilt. But I didn't care what they thought. I wasn't seeking redemption, I was setting something free. A week later, the community held a gathering by the lake to mark the transition. There was food, laughter, and soft music that carried over the water. Kids splashed near the shore as parents watched, smiling. Lanterns were lit at sunset, floating like tiny stars over the surface. Someone had carved a wooden sign and nailed it to the old HOA gate. "Welcome to Waverly Valley, belongs to everyone." The moment I saw it, something in me unclenched, a weight I'd carried since the day the HOA first came after me. Margaret would have hated it, I thought. But then again, maybe she wouldn't. Maybe this was what she'd meant all along. As the last lantern drifted across the lake, I stood at the dock, holding her locket one last time. The moonlight glimmered against its silver frame, soft and forgiving. I opened it, stared at the tiny photograph of her and my father, two young dreamers who once believed they could own paradise. Then I dropped it into the water. The ripples spread wide, catching the light before fading into stillness. I whispered, "It's yours now. All of it." The night breeze brushed against my face, cool and almost human, like an answer. Months passed again. The valley's trust thrived. People began small farms, restored trails, even built a schoolhouse by the northern ridge. Wildlife returned, deer, herons, even a pair of bald eagles that nested near the cliffs. Life reborn from ruin. I started painting again. Landscapes, mostly. The lake at dawn. The valley in autumn. Sometimes, without realizing, I'd paint her silhouette, distant, standing by the water's edge. Not haunting, not sorrowful. Just watching. And one morning, while sketching by the dock, I noticed something strange. A figure, faint but real, standing on the far side of the lake. A woman in a gray coat, her hair catching the wind. I blinked, and she was gone. Maybe it was the mist. Or maybe Margaret Hale had come back, not as the tyrant she once was, but as the guardian she was meant to be. Years later, people still talk about the Waverly War, the HOA that destroyed itself, and the man who gave everything away. They tell it like a legend, a story about greed, justice, and forgiveness. But that's not what it was. It was a lesson. That no one truly owns the earth beneath their feet. We only borrow it, for as long as we care enough to protect it. I stayed in the valley, growing older with it, watching generations come and go, hearing laughter replace the echoes of fear. And sometimes, when the moon was full and the lake perfectly still, I swore I heard a voice in the wind, soft, almost proud. It whispered, "You took care of it." And I'd smile, whispering back into the dark, "We did." The valley remains, free, untouched, eternal. And though time moves on and names fade into stories, the truth endures, that power built on control always collapses, but power built on compassion lasts forever. Waverly Valley is proof. Because, in the end, the valley belongs to no one. And that's exactly how it should be.